Hi there, my name is Julia Crone, and I am a Keep Indiana Learning digital coach, and I'm so glad you're joining this session today. Just as a reminder, the closed captioning is available through Zoom if you want to turn on the transcript feature on your device. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to Shantae, who will be presenting on embracing equity to strive towards excellence. This is a session in which administrators and school leaders will learn the steps to begin equity work or continue the beginning of stages of equity work to drive their school towards excellence. Shantae S. Barnes, also known as Educator Barnes, is a married mother of identical twins. She is currently an educational consultant and adjunct college instructor. Previously, she has served as a middle school academic dean, an English teacher, an English learners teacher, a literacy coach, and a librarian. She is also an education writer and an editor-in-chief for Indy K-12, hosts the podcast Brazen Education, and moderates Indianapolis Recorders EdGems. You can also go to www.educatorbarnes.com to learn more. So without further ado, here is Shantae on embracing equity to strive towards excellence.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. The one thing I want to say is that this presentation focuses on either starting equity work in your school or continuing equity work in your school. And I like to focus equity work on striving towards excellence because here recently, a lot of schools have been starting to gear towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is great, but there's been this negative stigma behind it that we're saying that your school is horrible or that is broken. And what my lens and my viewpoint is that we're just trying to make the schools better than what they were before. And we're not necessarily saying that your school is horrible, because every school I've been in, even when I've worked in schools that were considered failing schools due to their achievement on standardized tests, there were still pockets of excellence and greatness happening in all those settings. And so my goal today is just to help you all take that greatness and those pockets of excellence and keep striving towards that and push other areas where you may not be as close to the mark of excellence to get there. So the goal of this workshop is just to get you to continue your equity work and to drive your school towards excellence. The very first thing when it comes to this type of work is, what is your why? There's a lot of reasons here lately why schools have been shifting to this work, but I think it's super important to think about the why behind it. Some people felt the need, some school districts felt the need to respond after the death of George Floyd last summer, and then with the protests that happened around the world. And whatever your motivation is for doing this work, that's great, but you need to be super clear about your why, because that is what drives you. What I like to know to many schools is that a lot of people were already doing this type of work. Now there's this pressure or a need to feel to be more explicit with the work. And so before you get into the work, you need to think about, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because of fear? Am I fearing that someone's going to call my school out or my organization out because they feel like I'm not doing this work? Am I diving into this work because I know we're doing it and I want to get it better? Or you see a gap where we haven't really been addressing issues of equity, and so I want to start addressing them. But knowing what category you're in determines how you respond and how you react to this work, and that determines what you do. So my why do I do this work? I always tell people that equity work isn't a book, it isn't a workshop, it isn't a committee. It's an opportunity to help all students and all staff, because equity work does include having an equitable environment for your staff, to drive them towards success. So I do this work because I want to see teachers that I mentor and coach and support be successful. I want to see students be successful and reach their goals and become great citizens, whether that's locally or even in our greater global community. So just a couple reminders, your why is your guiding star. This work can get hard at times, and so knowing what your guiding star is, you can go back to that, and it's your reminder to push on when the work is tough. Later on in this presentation, I will talk about pushback, how you can deal with pushback and move forward. So defining equity. If we're going to talk about equity, we need to know what it is. On the right, this is a picture of Dr. Erica Buchanan Rivera. She is the Director of Equity and Inclusion in Washington Township. In complete transparency, I am a resident of Washington Township, and those are my two boys. A couple of weeks ago, they participated in Washington Township's first ever resilience camp. And this resilience camp was just an opportunity for students K through 6 to come together and just to learn about how to be resilient and to learn different skills. So they learned how to play chess. They learned how to interact with others. They learned about taking turns. They learned about greeting people in various languages. And one of the speakers was Dr. EBR. That's one of her another way she presents herself. And so I asked my boys, I said, well, what did Dr. EBR talk to you about? And they said, well, she talked to us about equity. And I said, so what is equity? And my son said to me that everyone gets what they need to be successful. And for me, if your equity definition is a big old paragraph and no one can understand it, it needs to be as simple. And my boys will be in 5th grade next year, they're twins. It should be as simple as a 5th grader can understand and say it back to you. Everyone gets what they need to be successful. And then they went on to explain that she just explained like what her role is in the district and how her goal is to help every kid, regardless of who they are, where they come from, helps them to be successful. So it's really important that you define equity. Some of the questions I get, well, what should we call this work? Should it be diversity, equity, inclusion? Should it be this diversity and inclusion? Should it be equity and inclusion? Should it be diversity, equity, inclusion, and access? Again, it doesn't really matter what we call it. I'm actually going to talk about what we call this work later. It's a more important about what you are doing. So for example, Dr. Buchanan, her title is Director of Equity and Inclusion. Equity is more than race. Equity deals with gender, different backgrounds. And so I personally feel that diversity is included in equity. So if you're doing true equity work, you address that. But I also feel the need, and oh, I forgot opportunity, because some people add opportunity to their work. So regardless of what you're doing, really the needs in your community, in your school district drives what you may call this work. But I encourage you not to get tied up in the name of the work, because we don't want to spend so much time on what we name it. We want to spend more time on what we are actually doing to be successful. So if you're going to do equity work, the first work you have to do is self-work. And one of the places you need to start is with who is in your circle. There's an activity I used to do, I have expanded now. There's an activity I used to do where I would give people different color crowns or different type of beads, and they would have to label who was in their circle, and they had to assign a race to it. So for example, when I did mine, I would say my pastor is of this race, my hairstylist is this race, my friends look like this. And what a lot of people found is people that were in their circle were very similar racially to them. But as I continue my work, I realized that, equity work is not just about race. There's other types of people in your circle. And so do you have different people in your circle from various backgrounds? Do you have different people in your circle from various sexual orientations? Do you have different people of different abilities? So when I think about my circle, I know a parent who has a child that's in a wheelchair. And this connection allowed me to be more open. So for example, during the time I was an elementary librarian, one of the things that was done was the book shelves were moved to make the library more accessible to kids in wheelchairs, because every shelf or bookcase, every kid couldn't get around it, especially if they were in a wheelchair. And so evaluating who is in your circle gives you different viewpoints and different lenses. So if your circle is full of people that are completely like-minded and completely like you, I encourage you to expand your circle to people of different backgrounds, people of different religions, people of different abilities. So you can have people in your circle, because when you have those people in your circle, when you're having conversations with them, they may be able to identify gaps you have, because that is not your lived experience. So normally when I say all that, people are like, yeah, Shante, that's great. So like, how do I actually do that? Like, how do I expand my circle? Some of that is just getting out into the community. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, my school wants to attract more Black teachers, but I don't know how to find them. And so sometimes I say things like, Did you go to the education event that the Indiana Black Expo hosts? Have you been to a Black church? A lot of educators are there. Do you go to events that are primarily gauged towards Black people? So to intentionally expand your circle, you have to get out in the community. With my sons a lot, I try to be intentional. So we go to tons of international festivals. In India, we've been to the Asian Fest, we've been to the Italian Festival, we've been to the different festivals about Germany. I just take my kids to so many different places because at those places, you may find opportunity to sign up to participate in more work and make more connections. So just by going to events and festivals and engaging with the booth, A, I'm expanding my knowledge base, and B, I might be able to sign up for a newsletter or a workshop where I can learn more. And then the other reason why this is important, this allows you to find thought partners. I have tons of thought partners across the state of Indiana and across the United States, and even some thought partners that don't live in the United States. My education thought partner groups are full of educators from rural Indiana, suburban Indiana, urban Indiana, educators who work in religious schools, educators that work in private schools, educators that work in charter schools, educators that work in traditional public schools, and educators of various race, various religious beliefs, or some educators I know don't believe in the existence of a God. They don't practice religion, but I have different people in my network because there's going to be times when you come across situations where you're like, I don't know what to do. So who do I reach out to? And a lot of these connections I made just by doing work in the community. That could be when IDOE sends out their newsletter. So side note, if you're not signed up to the IDOE newsletter, I suggest you sign up to it. Dr. Jenner does a great job at the beginning of the newsletter, championing and shouting out great work that's happening in Indiana. But there's also a lot of opportunity to sign up for feedback. And through some of that work I've done ideally by just giving feedback, I've connected to other educators. So I have educators in rural Indiana that I reach out to and I say, you know, I'm thinking about this. What do you guys do at your school? Because sometimes there are things that are happening. Because remember, I said that greatness is happening everywhere. There's things that's happening in rural Indiana that I said, ooh, I had not thought about that. I bet I could make that work in my setting or tweak that to work in my setting. So just putting yourself out there. And I also am very big about not overcommitting. So I try to do 1 or 2 things a year. If you care about boosting your resume, it's great to show that you are actively engaging in processes in our state to improve education, but also it gives you the opportunity just to meet other people. So self-work can be hard, and I'm going to tell you a little story about self-work. So I mentioned, under Dr. McCormick's administration, so her last 3 years, I was part of the IDOE Cultural Competency Advisory Council. And I'm not sure how that works going to change under Dr. Jenner because we're going to be connecting with Governor Holcomb's Diversity, Inclusion, and Opportunity Officer. I'm pretty sure I got that right, to determine how our work will continue. But one of the days I was at the committee and, you know, our committee is pretty diverse. And I was, you know, pushing back on some of the stuff that was said because I really felt like Black students weren't being heard. And one of my friends that's on the committee, she is part of the Cherokee Nation, and she called me out at the meeting. She had noted that, you know, I wasn't listening to the needs of Indigenous students in Indiana. And I'm going to tell you that stung. It stung because I consider this person my friend and stuff like, oh my gosh, you called me out in front of everyone. But I had to pause, I had to reflect, and I had to think about my actions. And she was right. And so when you love someone, so I love my children, sometimes they don't feel like it. Sometimes I have to chastise them a little bit and say, hey, like, this is not what we do here in this house. And so sometimes when you're doing this work, you may feel emotionally harmed, or you may feel like put down, or feel like you stepped on somebody's toes. And that's going to happen. This work is messy. Again, there's going to be experiences that aren't your lived experience. I couldn't see her lived experience because that wasn't my lived experience. And so what I did, instead of being defensive or like arguing back, I literally stopped talking and I listened. And when I started to listen, I said, oh, I really did overlook those things. And so this work is, as you're doing this work, please be open to being reflective. Please be open to rethinking some of your views. And then if you come across a view that you need to rethink, go ahead and revise what you're doing. So I just want to note it. It can be hard, even myself. And I guess I'll tell you another short story. In my classroom library, I had tons of different books and different backgrounds. And I had a Latino student come up to me and he said, you know, Mrs. Barnes, I love your library, but you have two authors who are Latino on your shelf. And I was like, I just felt like called out, but the student was right. And I had more Asian authors, more Black authors. I tried to make sure there was equity between female and male authors, but I did not. So having that student say that to me gave me the lens of I need to do better. And the student highly respected me, said that he enjoyed all the different books I provided, but asked would I consider bringing more Latino authors to my library. So yes, sometimes feedback can sting, but constructive criticism isn't always a bad thing, and it helps us to improve. So if you're gonna do this work, you can't do it alone. I get really concerned when I see school districts across our state that are making diversity, equity, inclusion officers, or whatever they're calling that title, because I know the title varies across our great state, that they don't have support. It's not clear of if they have a team or who they get to work with in the school building. It's important if you're doing this work that this work is not alone. And there are certain people that needs to be a part of this work. And so I actually listed out the type of people that should be a part of this work. You should have parents as a part of this work, certified and classified staff. And this is important. I'm working right now with a rural school district in southeastern Indiana. And when I was working with them, one of the issues that was brought up was about the cafeteria. And so you can't have your certified staff talking about the cafeteria and making solutions about the cafeteria without having the people that work in the cafeteria at the table. You want to make sure you have students at the table. When we think about this, when we think about schools, schools are a place where our students learn, we help them grow, and we want them to be successful. But a lot of times we are making decisions for students without even hearing from students. So that's super important. Admin needs to be a part of your work, and that is building level administrators and district level administrators, because sometimes a issue or a concern may be brought up that's not just local to your school building. It could be a district-wide situation. So you want to be able, and granted, if depending on your school district, that may be the superintendent or assistant superintendent or a district level coach, and they may not be able to come to every single meeting, but there should be some type of meeting with those people to make sure they're in the loop. So if there's something that needs to be addressed more district-wide, that it can be done. And then you want to make sure you have community members. And when I say community members, that could be people that live in your community but don't have kids in your district anymore. In Washington Township, I'm actually part of one of their equity committees, and I'm serving on that from the lens of a parent. But there are people on the committee that are just community members. Some of them had kids that went through the school district. Some of them don't have kids that are in the school district, but they live in the school district and they care about the children in their neighborhood, and they're community partners. The school district I'm working with in southeastern Indiana, there's a representative from 4-H that participates in the work. And even though this person serves multiple school districts down in southeastern Indiana, it's just really great to have that person part of the work, because that brings an extra lens to when we have these students out in our community doing community work. What are things that I could be doing out here in the community that can better help the school and the students who are involved? So when you are building your team, there's several things you need to consider, and I'm going to break down what these things are. So one of the things you have to consider is when will you meet? Currently with two, so I'm working with a school district through my consulting work in southeastern Indiana and a private school in Indianapolis. One of the things I had to first establish is when are you going to meet to do this work? some of the frustration with equity work is people feel like it's a checked box. People don't really understand what the purpose of it. People don't understand when the meetings are actually happening. And so that has to be super clear. Is this a situation where you're meeting quarterly? Are you meeting every other week? Are you meeting monthly? Where are you going to meet? What is going to be your policy and procedures? You have to reschedule meetings. Things happen. We're in Indiana. Inclement weather happens. And granted, now with us living through a pandemic, there's ways that we can continue to meet, even if we can't meet in person. But you have to have a plan just in case school closes, or let's say the principal is the person driving the work and the principal's not available and there's no one else to take over. You have to have a plan to reschedule your meetings, because if meetings aren't rescheduled, people feel like, oh, well, this isn't important, because but the meetings keep getting canceled and they don't get rescheduled. So it's really intentional. And so you have to look at your school calendar and figure out when this is going to happen, how is this time going to be protected, and can you have differing times? So for example, the equity work I'm doing in Southeastern Indiana, we have parents, stakeholders that are participating in the work. Well, depending on the parent, they may have different times of availability. So if we always have the meetings in the morning, there are a group of parents that can't meet. Or if we always have them in the evening, there's a group of parents that can't meet. So it's also important to consider that maybe every other month the meetings are in the morning, and the alternating months the meetings are in the afternoon. Is it possible to do work on the weekends? And I know that gets tricky, especially when you're involving educators and that's unpaid time. But you have to figure out what will work to get the greatest number of stakeholders working together to meet. Then what will your group be called? So the group that I'm working with in Southeastern Indiana, they call their work Bridge Builders. And then in Washington Township, where I participate from the parents' lens, it's called the Metropolitan School District of Washington Township Community Coalition. If you notice, in none of these titles do they have or the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Group or the Equity Group. And you know, some people, you have a group of people is like, well, if you don't name it that, are you really doing the work? And I always argue there's a lot of people that have that in their name. They're not doing too much of anything. And so, we thought about the word bridge builders. We thought about, well, what is the purpose of the group? And the principal I was talking to, the principal said, well, I want to build a bridge between all of these different groups. And so that's how we came up with that name, because even though we're doing equity work, even though we're trying to make sure we're addressing diversity, even though we're trying to make sure we're being inclusive and making sure everyone has the opportunity to a great education and accessibility throughout the school building, the goal is to build bridges between people. And then the community coalition, we did have, I think, the word equity in the title at some point in time, and we just kind of dropped it because first of all, we felt like the name was already long enough. And second of all is we're a coalition. We're a group of people. We're all community members, and we are just working together for the betterment of the school. So I encourage you to not necessarily feel pressure to put quote unquote buzzwords in the name of your group. Just call it based on what your group is actually trying to achieve. So based on that, so after you establish what your group's going to be called, you really have to do mission and vision work. I actually facilitated mission and vision work for Bridge Builders. And what I did is first we started with the school district. Typically, school districts have missions and visions, or they may have a mission and not a vision. You want to start with there, because whatever work you're doing in your individual school district, it should align with established missions and vision that already exist in your district. So I showed them what existed already in their district. And then I thought about the school. And one of the things we did was we looked at the demographics of the school, like who's in the school, what percentage of students have free and reduced lunch, what percentage of students are English learners, what percentage of students are from different racial backgrounds. And then from there, we thought about, well, what do we want this school to represent? And so I had them look at the mission statement of the district, think about the school, and then they came up with different words that they associated. And we did that around the mission, and we did that around the vision. And then we came up with these two statements. So the mission of Bridge Builders is to create a safe, nurturing, and rigorous environment that inspires students' passion for learning, creates global thinkers, builds students' resilience, and celebrates our diversity in our school community. And some of the buzzwords that kept coming up for this particular group was making sure that we are making a focus on having rigorous academics, making sure that we're building student resiliency, and that we're celebrating diversity. Because they wanted diversity to not be like this checkbox, but just be a great celebration. And then when you get to the vision work, based on the words that they came up, one of the words that was mentioned a lot from this group was tenacity. They wanted students to kind of have that grit and that go for it, and be lifelong learners. And this school district has an immersion program within the district. And so it's really important for them that their students not only be able to be successful in their community, but be successful if they would choose to move to a different country. Also, I won't read through all of this, but this is the mission and vision for the MSD Community Coalition. And as you notice, this mission and vision statement has different things. So they put in that they didn't want educational outcomes predicted by social, economic status, race, gender, ability, or any other relevant social factor. And that phrase right there was added because we got into the weeds of, oh, we should put this, we should put that, we should put that. And we said, you know, society continues to change. And if we list out everything, there could also be something that comes up in the future. So that other relevant social factor includes things that we may not have thought of or things that come up in the future. And then when it came to the mission, it was important that there's affirming spaces that students felt affirmed by who they were. And so based on the work that you're trying to do, your mission and your vision will develop based on the needs of your group and your community. I think it's great to always look at the mission and vision of other people because it could give you some ideas, but it really should be tailored to your community and your work. And so Washington Township is an urban school district. Bridge Builders is rural district in Indiana. So you can see the differences between them, but there are some similarities and some overlap. So after with Bridge Builders, we did the work around the mission and the vision. We had to determine what our focus areas were. So the first meeting we had, we actually went over concerns, and that meeting was tough. That meeting essentially allowed staff and parents to really share all the concerns they had about the school or the district at large. And it can be hard when you're sitting there and, I mean, if you're working in a school district, you're there because you love the school district, you love the students, and you have pride in it. So it can be hard to hear comments or concerns that A, you weren't aware of, or B, that you may not agree with, or C, you're like, I don't even know where we start to even address that. So from that, we had that list. The second meeting, we did our mission and vision. And in the third meeting, I took all of those concerns and threw it into a survey. So this is why this matters. If you're doing any type of work, and I don't care what type of work it is, you can't do everything at one time in one school year. That's just not feasible. Well, let me put it to you this way. You could do a whole bunch of stuff, but you won't do it well. And remember, our goal is striving towards excellence. So you really do want to be able to do it well. So I threw all of those concerns into a survey, and I asked, and we sent it out to parents, to staff. We asked, what are your top 3 things that you want the school to address next school year? So based on that, people filled out the survey, and we had our top 3 areas that we wanted as a focus. But then we said, you know, all these other areas are still of a concern, so we will address them. And then some of those concerns were what I would call low-hanging fruit, were things that really doesn't need a committee, doesn't need a whole bunch of people. It's like, oh, we can like fix that right now. Oh, you didn't get access to that. Oh, we can throw a link on the website for that. So some of those things, if they're low-hanging fruit. So the other thing I acknowledge, that if there's something that we can fix overnight, that's a low lift, we'll check that stuff off. But then we have our big focus areas. And so those big focus areas are the ones that you use to drive your work for the next school year. You also want to make clear that these focus areas, they will continue the school year after that, but then you're going to pull in these other things that were initially spoke of. And then if there's new things that come up, then you'll reevaluate. Communication is key. So in Washington Township, my sons, they are, well, last school year, they were in 4th grade, and their principal sends out a weekly newsletter every Sunday, 6 p.m. on the dot. In this newsletter, she added about a couple school years ago, a little box just about work they were doing in the school. And it was just simple things like this is a training our teachers had. We did some training around positive discipline. And so as a parent, I knew what the teachers had been trained in. I knew that our school had a amygdala reset room. And I actually have been in the room. You go in the room, the ceiling tiles are clouds. There's a mat the kids can lay on the floor. There's bikes where they can exercise, stress balls, different fidgets. And so those are things I would not have known about had that not been communicated. I also know a lot of schools use different apps, Parent Square, things like that. If you're using different apps, maybe that's the way you push out that information. But the information should be communicated clearly. So in education, we have all types of jargon, ILP, IEP, all these different things. Parents may not know what all these different acronyms mean. So you really need to break it down. So even when you say amygdala reset room, you could have a parent like, what is an amygdala? So you have to explain like what that is. What is this room about? What does this mean? And why should I care about it? And then also in your communication, it should be super clear that if you were to participate, here's how you can participate, because we all have different capacities, right? So the school year, when I found out I was pregnant with my twin boys, I wasn't able to participate in a lot of things. But later on, as they got older, I had greater capacity. So even though someone cannot participate now, it's still important to keep them involved in the work, because when they are able to participate, they're not just out of the loop about what you are doing. So one of the things you have to prepare for is pushback. Right now, if you listen to the news at all, you're hearing there's a lot of stuff in the news about critical race theory. It's being banned in different states. The first thing I'm going to say straight up, I am not an expert on critical race theory. So I'm not talking about critical race theory. That's not what I'm an expert in. And sometimes that's being conflated or confused with culturally responsive teaching. I do talk a lot about culturally responsive teaching, which is simply aligning your strategies and your curriculum and your resources to the kids who are in the room that you are serving. And so when pushback happens, we have a couple of responses. There's fear. There's fear of, because you have parents that are like, I'm going to call the media. And some of them actually do. You have flight. You know what? This work is getting too hard. I can go to another school. I do not have to deal with this. And you have fight. And you will have school districts that are responding back in ways that may be abrasive and are not restorative. What I would encourage you to do is avoid the 3 R's, 3 F's rather, and commit to the 3 R's, which is reflect, re-explain, and reach out. Reflect is hit pause. You may hear something that is like, I really don't know if that actually happened. I don't see it that way, but just reflect about what is being said. Re-explain. Sometimes there's confusion because people don't understand what's happening. There's been several school districts that have come out and said, we are not teaching critical race theory, and people think they are. And so that may be a situation where you explain, this is how we adopt curriculum. This is what's in the curriculum. Here's the actual curriculum. Here's a website. You could go read about it. And then reach out. Sometimes things are beyond your capacity. Earlier this week, there was so let me go back. So there's a transgender student from Virginia. When he was 15, he was no longer allowed to go to the bathroom, the gender that he was identifying as. The student was born a female, but now identifies as a male. And so the school district came back and said that the student could either use the bathroom in the nurse's office or use a private bathroom. Students sued. Lower court found that the school district was in the wrong and that the student had the right to go into the male restroom. School district appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided not to hear the case, which means the ruler of the lower court stands. And so why I am mentioning this is you may not be an issue on issues around non-binary students or transgender students or students that are part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And so you may need to reach out to get some help to respond to the pushback. I worked in a school, I've had transgender students, I worked in a school where that was the policy. The transgender students typically use the restroom in the nurse's office, or we had this other restroom. And actually, it was interesting. This particular restroom was a private restroom. It wasn't a staff restroom, but it was actually designed for students who were in wheelchair or had other needs to give them more space. And so that actually became a secondary issue with parents of those students, because they said, well, these bathrooms were actually designed for my child that's in a wheelchair or my child who has this walker, and now they're sharing it. So I would say these situations can be touchy. You may get in a situation where, regardless of what you decide, somebody is angry. And if you're not an expert on it, I suggest you reach out. And that's actually one of the things I've been learning more about is just about transgender students, non-binary students. How do we better serve them? What do the laws say? Becoming more informed. And so if you are reflecting, if you're explaining what you're doing and you're reaching out for help, that's how you prepare for pushback. So what's also important are the resources that you're going to use and how you're going to hold yourself accountable. I always get asked, okay, Shantae, so what book do I need to read? And I said, well, what are you doing? I mean, we're doing like equity work, diversity, equity, inclusion, like give me a book. And typically I said, well, I'm not going to give you a book. And so I'm like, why would you? Okay, so this is not a book club. And it always annoys me when people do equity work and the first thing they want to do is read a book. And I'm like, what are you reading a book about? And so, for example, the private school I'm working with, the book that their teachers are reading are the Eric Jensen book, Teaching Students with Poverty in Mind and Engaging Students with Poverty in Mind. They chose that particular book because this private school demographics shifted, and they have more students living in poverty, and the teachers weren't really sure how to serve them better. So based on the work that they were doing and the students they were serving, they determined the resources that they need. And so if your first thing that you want to do is go read a whole bunch of books, and you're just reading random books, you may be reading books about situations that are not applicable to your particular situation. So first you have to identify what your needs are. And like I mentioned, that survey is a great way to do it. And then you identify the resources that you need based on those. And then you have to hold yourself accountable. So the next thing I'm actually doing with the Bridge Builder work, we have the 3 areas of concern that we're going to address. And now we're going to come up with accountability measures. So what thing is going to change that shows that we address this issue? So one of the areas that we are focusing on is around discipline. Well, discipline could be a whole big thing. What are things that we're going to accomplish to show that we address this? Is this revising the discipline handbook? Is this lowering referrals by 25%? Is this increasing opportunities for the counselor to work with students by 50%? So they're doing less paperwork and spending more time with students. So you have to have these evaluative measures, because it's easy to say we're doing work and then have nothing to show for the work. And then at the end, you have to do some type of survey to get feedback about how people perceived how the work was doing, and also involve students. So with Bridge Builders, we haven't involved our students yet. They will be involved next school year because there's some existing student groups, and so we're going to tap them into the work. With the committee that I'm on as a parent, they actually surveyed the students. They did a survey of the students around virtual learning and how students were doing with that and just learning in general. So that information we got from students, and those surveys, it was time consuming because it wasn't just like, here's a survey link. It was like in person, I'm going to talk to you, bring groups of students together and talk to them and get feedback. And you also have to think about, how are we going to talk to different stakeholders? Our little kindergartners, they have voices too, and maybe it's a very simple question. And do you feel happy, indifferent, or sad? But we really want to know how everyone is feeling. And then you have to evaluate your goals and then share your successes. This work should bring you joy. This work should help your school improve. And you want to make sure you're sharing your successes, because what people don't want to hear about is just negativity all the time. You want to hear, because we did this work, our referrals are down by 30% and less kids are being sent out of the classroom, and teachers have strategies that they can use. Because one of the things I caution people about when it comes to discipline work is lowering referrals that's just isn't it. Like, you have to do more than that, because in some schools that turns into, well, don't send anybody to the office. Well, now you have a child in your class misbehaving. I can't send them to the office and I don't know what to do. So you also want to make sure that your goals are not putting a band-aid over issues, and that they go pretty deep and address multiple areas. And also, was preparing for pushback, I want to also say that self-care is important. And I know self-care has been a buzzword. Actually, a conference in Atlanta. Actually, I spoke in Atlanta, and then I spoke in Chicago a few years back, because they ended up doing mini conferences. And one of the things, you have to have boundaries. I was talking to someone that's doing this work, and after a meeting, there was a parent, and that this person met with this parent for 3 hours after the meeting. And sometimes it's important to get that investment, but also you have to have boundaries of saying, like, hey, like, I can't give you 3 hours after every meeting to hear complaints. Here is a way that you can share your complaints, and here's when I'm available. And then finding joy. This work should bring you joy because you're making things better. I think about the student in the wheelchair who now can get around the library and get their own books and not have to send a friend to pull books from the shelf to put it in to look at. So finding joy in the wins and celebrating those wins. And then spending time with family and friends, because, like, this work cannot consume your life. It should not consume your life. It should be part of who you are. It should be something that you're proud about, but it shouldn't be a situation where you're not doing any of the things that bring you joy. And if you do follow me on Twitter, I've been doing a joy journal. I started it about 20 days ago. I had a 3-day hiatus. For those of you that don't know, my father actually passed away in January. And so I'd done a joy journal before on Twitter. Essentially every single day, I just tweet one thing that brought me joy for that day. And you can apply that to different work. I did it when I was in school some days, like, especially like when you come back after spring break, and that stretch from spring break to summertime is just rough. I would write down in my little notebook something that brought me joy in my classroom that day. Because sometimes you're just like, man, you guys are squirrely, you guys are all over the place. This day was horrible. And I'm like, well, no, Johnny, the light bulb came on, and this concept I've been teaching for 2 weeks. Johnny got it today. Let me write that down. So it's really important to have thought about, what are you going to do to celebrate your success, and what are you going to do to take care of yourself and protect yourself. So I normally in my presentation add in problem solving time. So I don't know how many people are here right now, because I can't see the participants in my presentation mode. But if there are any questions or situations that anybody would like to ask me about, I'm more than happy to give some feedback or some initial thoughts. All right. If you do have any questions and you want to ask me that, this is all of my contact information. You can email me at educator.ssbarnes@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at educatorbarnes, and Facebook, facebook.com/educatorbarnes. And those are different ways to follow me. I also do write for publication. I'm the editor-in-chief of NEK12. We write about a lot of different issues. All of the writers for NEK12 are Black. Most of us are educators, and so we write about education with that lens, but we also talk more generally too. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to check us out there. But hopefully this has been informative. Hopefully this is giving you some ideas of how to get started. If you would like to connect with me and you're listening to this presentation, I'll be more than happy to connect with you. I'll be more than happy to be your thought partner. I have people that call me up and say, hey, we're having issues with this group of students. Could I just kind of share with you what's happening? Could you give me some feedback? I would love to do that. So hopefully this has been informative. Hopefully you found some gems that you can use. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Shantae. Remember to follow Educator Barnes. I think that was super helpful just of myself as a parent of young children, and then also as an educator as well too. But just, you know, the kind of thinking that I'd like not only in my classroom, but even for my children at home as well too. So I thought there were some fantastic gems, and I love the help that you are extending out to people. So reminder to participants as well, make sure that you take that survey that's linked under the documents, and that will be what will trigger your PGP points. And Shantae, I think you're absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.